All right, let's dive into one of the most obscure and frankly haunting chapters in the Imperium's naval history, the shard fleets. You won't find many official records on them, and those that exist are either redacted, burned, or stashed deep within the vaults of the Inquisition. But if you listen carefully to whispers from rogue traders, scattered astropathic fragments, and the few surviving commanders who dare speak of them, a chilling picture begins to form. The shard fleets weren't just another offshoot of the Imperial Navy. They were something else entirely, experimental, ruthless, and designed with a terrifying purpose. And when they were unleashed upon the Orks, the galaxy held its breath. Because for the first time in ages, the Imperium didn't just want to win. It wanted to erase, to dismantle a threat not just with firepower, but with strategic brutality bordering on the heretical. Why should anyone care? Because this wasn't just a battle. It was a calculated gamble on the edge of madness. And in true Warhammer fashion, what followed wasn't triumph or tragedy. It was both. When people talk about the might of the Imperium's fleets, they usually think about the colossal battle fleets of Segmentum Solar or the disciplined strength of Battlefleet Gothic. Massive armadas made up of kilometer-long void craft, endless regiments of support vessels, and a staggering logistics backbone that grinds forward like a juggernaut of faith and fire. But the shard fleets? They were never meant to follow that mold. They were designed in the shadows, pieced together like puzzle fragments of forgotten doctrines, restricted technology, and unconventional command structures. What makes a shard fleet different isn't just the way it fights, it's the way it thinks, or rather, the way it's allowed to think. See, standard Imperial fleets are bureaucratic monsters. Every decision is slow, weighed down by layers of command and rituals. But shard fleets? They were decentralized, broken into autonomous shards, hence the name. Each shard acted like a splinter of a greater mind, a shard of the whole, and was commanded to operate independently, often without direct oversight from Terra. That alone should tell you how desperate or daring someone had to be to approve such an idea. There's this old story whispered among voidsmen about how one of the first shard fleets didn't even report back to Segmentum Command for over 5 years, and when it did, the only thing transmitted was a data burst containing coordinates and a single word: cleansed. That kind of operational freedom is unheard of in the Imperium, where entire crusades can be paralyzed by a lack of proper litanies or the wrong seal on a document. The shard fleets were a middle finger to that entire system. Structurally, they were scattered and modular. Think less in terms of a grand flagship surrounded by subordinates, and more like hunter-killer packs. Each shard, whether a single light cruiser supported by stealth corvettes or a strike force of repurposed Mechanicus vessels, had its own task, its own commander, and its own protocols. Some leaned into psyker warfare, using sanctioned witch covens to destabilize enemy morale. Others relied heavily on stealth, deploying ships that didn't exist on any Navy roster, black-hulled vessels with no visible heraldry. Then there were the infamous shards composed almost entirely of penal legions in orbit-to-surface drop barges, brutal, messy, and terrifyingly efficient. But what truly set the shard fleets apart was ideology. Regular fleets are all about defense, about holding the line in the Emperor's name. Shard fleets were predators, designed not to protect, but to stalk and exterminate. They weren't bound by the same notions of honor or attrition. If a shard had to burn an entire agri-world to deny resources to the Orks, it would. And it did. There are records, well, more like fragmented logs, of entire planets being sacrificed not to the enemy, but to strategy. That level of cold calculation only made sense within the warped context of the wider war. One of the most compelling and frankly disturbing theories I've come across suggests that some shards weren't even commanded by living admirals. There's evidence of AI-assisted command matrices being used under the guise of blessed cogitators. The Adeptus Mechanicus swears up and down they'd never allow such heresy, but the silence from Mars on this matter speaks volumes. Could the Imperium have willingly deployed fleets guided by near-sentient systems? Maybe. And if they did, it would explain the eerie synchronicity some shards displayed in battle. Then there's the matter of their origins, which we'll get into later, but just know this. These fleets didn't come out of nowhere. They were shaped by paranoia, by desperation, and by voices in high places who understood that the kind of war the Imperium was facing couldn't be fought with tradition alone. The shard fleets were the answer to a question no one wanted to ask. What happens when victory is more important than survival? I remember reading an account from a surviving crewman of one such shard, who described their ship's bridge not as a command center, but as a shrine to entropy. Walls covered in unblinking servo skulls, command consoles fused with living flesh, and orders that came not from voxcasters, but from dreams induced by psychic implants. Whether that's just void madness or something more experimental, I can't say. But the truth is that shard fleets embraced the unorthodox to a degree that scared even the Inquisition, and that's saying something. It's no wonder they were kept secret. You don't parade around tools like this. You hide them, you deny they ever existed. And if they succeed, you let the official histories claim it was the work of some brave Battlefleet Lord Admiral and quietly erase every mention of the shards. But for those who know what to look for, the orbital patterns of scorched planets, the strange formations carved into the crusts of moons, the hollowed-out hulks of Orc space hulks that seem to have been killed from the inside, there's no doubt. The shard fleets were real, and they were unlike anything else the Imperium ever dared to unleash. You can't really understand the shard fleets unless you understand the atmosphere of paranoia, desperation, and cold pragmatism that birthed them. These weren't the kind of fleets born out of a grand vision of glory or expansion. They were forged in the crucible of failure, in the darkest backrooms of military command, when the usual tools of war had broken down. No one wanted to build them, not really. They were a necessity, a reaction to the kind of war the Imperium wasn't used to winning. From what I've gathered, the concept of the shard fleets first took shape not in the Navy's official doctrine, but in classified counterinsurgency operations during the later stages of the Macarian heresy. That war, which spiraled far beyond what anyone predicted, revealed just how ineffective the standard template of fleet warfare could be when dealing with dispersed, mobile, and fanatical enemies. The idea was floated, quietly, of course, that perhaps centralized command was the problem. That maybe a fleet didn't need a Grand Admiral barking orders from a cathedral-sized command throne, but a dozen independent captains operating like predators in the void. But even then, the idea was shelved. Too radical, too dangerous. It wasn't until the Orc infestations in the southern reaches of Segmentum Pacificus began to mutate into something closer to a wah than a mere pest control issue that the old idea was dusted off. And this time, it wasn't dismissed, it was accelerated. The Orcs weren't just swarming, they were adapting, building shipyards in asteroid belts, launching green tides into unsuspecting systems, learning how to warp hop with disturbing precision. Whole battle fleets were getting tied down, losing momentum, losing morale. There was a real fear that if something didn't change fast, the Imperium would lose control of several sectors, and once Orcs take root, they never stop growing. So someone, somewhere, most believe it was an alliance between elements of the Officio Strategos and the more radical members of the Ordo Xenos, decided to take a gamble. And thus the shard fleets were born not as a full-fledged doctrine, but as a quiet test. A whispered experiment given limited sanction, deliberately fragmented to avoid attention. There wasn't one command. There were several, each given autonomy, each left to interpret their mandate in their own way. This decentralization was the genius and the horror of the entire idea. Some say the original proposal came from Lord Militant Varian Corvos, a brilliant but disgraced strategist exiled to a desk job after suggesting the unthinkable, that perhaps the Imperium's own rigidity was its worst enemy. He'd spent years analyzing post-Horus heresy expeditionary data, noting how scattered strike elements had been more effective than full crusade fleets in dealing with highly mobile Xenos threats. His model was dismissed at the time, labeled as non-compliant with Sacred Fleet orthodoxy. But when the Orks started melting sectors into green nightmares, that heretical model started looking a lot more attractive. There's even a theory that the Inquisition didn't just allow the creation of the shard fleets, they orchestrated it. Not openly, of course. But when one starts cross-referencing deployment records and the sudden reappearance of decommissioned ships with sealed histories, the fingerprints are there. The Ordo Xenos, in particular, had every reason to want such a fleet to exist. Who better to study the ever-evolving Orks than a fleet not constrained by Codex-approved engagement protocols? And let's not forget the tech priests. Officially, Mars denied all involvement in anything unorthodox, but several shard fleets operated with technology that wasn't just rare. It was unclassified, experimental, and in some cases, downright forbidden. There were reports of warp surge projectors, silent-running gravitic hulls, and automated boarding pods that didn't need human crews. That kind of tech doesn't just appear in a void dock. Someone gave the green light. One of the more outlandish, but still popular, theories is that the idea for the shard fleets wasn't entirely human in origin. Some whisper that captured Eldar star charts, possibly obtained from rogue corsairs, or even dark dealings with the Drukhari, were used as the foundation for the fleet dispersal models. The very idea that the Imperium would stoop to Xenos tactics seems absurd until you see how these fleets moved. There's a strange elegance to it, a kind of calculated chaos that doesn't fit with the usual plodding aggression of Imperial fleet action. It's like they were dancing with the void, not pushing against it. Whatever the truth, the emergence of the shard fleets wasn't some grand declaration. It was a quiet shift in the dark, a few new designations in the fleet registers, a series of mysterious disappearances of mothballed ships, orders that bypassed traditional routes, and then one day they were just there, moving, hunting, unleashed. And it worked, at least at first. The early strikes against the Orks were brutal, efficient, and surgical. Whole Ork splinter fleets vanished without a trace. No heroic charges, no naval battles remembered in song. Just sudden silence. Systems going dark. Green tides turning into green graveyards. That kind of effectiveness didn't go unnoticed. And for a brief moment, the architects of the shard fleets believed they had created something beautiful. A solution. A tool that could reshape how the Imperium fought its endless wars. But like all things in the 41st millennium, beauty rarely lasts. The composition of a shard fleet was where things really got weird, in the best possible way if you're into the darker corners of Imperial experimentation. This wasn't your standard Navy group with a few line cruisers, a flagship, and escort vessels arranged in neat little hierarchies. A shard fleet looked more like a collection of ghost stories duct-taped together with desperation and brilliance. No two were exactly the same, and that was by design. Flexibility was the weapon. Predictability was the weakness, so they avoided it like the plague. Some shards were terrifyingly small. We're talking one main ship and a handful of escort-class vessels, destroyers, cobbled-together raiders, even civilian transports with reinforced hulls and military-grade void shields. Others, however, had firepower that rivaled an entire sector fleet, but with none of the oversight or documentation. These were the so-called ghost shards, the ones that operated without beacons, without call signs, and often without returning. I remember coming across a reference to a particular shard named only as Black Echo, composed entirely of retrofitted Mechanicus craft, each ship running silent protocols and displaying no Imperial iconography. Their hulls were obsidian black, allegedly coated in radiation-dampening composites sourced from Dark Age STCs. And they didn't vox. Ever. If you saw them coming, you weren't the target. If you didn't, well, you probably didn't live to tell the tale. Let's talk about ship classes. Sure, some of the vessels were familiar. Dictator-class carriers, lunar-class cruisers, maybe even the odd Retribution-class battleship. But these weren't the polished, parade-ready variants. These were modified, stripped down, and sometimes grafted with borderline heretic systems. There are unconfirmed reports of teleportarium arrays operating well beyond safe tolerances, allowing for ship-to-ship boarding actions with a precision that made even the Astartes jealous. Plasma drives were overcharged to achieve micro-jumps, letting ships phase in and out of detection arcs like shadows flitting through the warp. But here's where it gets even crazier. The crew complements weren't standard either. Sure, you had Navy personnel, but a lot of shard fleets incorporated forces you wouldn't expect in a void war. Penal legions, for starters. Entire battalions of condemned men stuffed into retrofitted troop transports with barely functioning life support, each one fitted with obedience collars and jettisoned into hostile zones like expendable data packets. Some shards treated these forces like blunt instruments. Others used them as psychological weapons. Imagine a wave of frothing, screaming lunatics slamming into an orc horde, sowing chaos just long enough for precision strikes to land. It's grotesque, but undeniably effective. Then there were the Black Ops specialists, operatives without insignia known only by code names. These weren't your usual stormtroopers or scions. We're talking people trained in Xenos infiltration, sabotage, and even Xenos mimicry. One theory, and I still don't know how to feel about it, suggests that at least one shard employed Jokero-modified human commandos, humans enhanced with reverse-engineered alien tech, able to hack orc machinery mid-battle and turn it against its masters. Another fan theory, admittedly more fringe, claims that certain shard elements used psychic clones, astropathic duplicates created through warp echoes of fallen psychers. Sounds insane, I know. But if even a tenth of it's true, it paints a picture of a fleet that played by no rules but its own, and you can't ignore the Mechanicus influence. Despite their public denials, the red-robed priests were everywhere in the shard fleets, providing not only tech support, but outright frontline elements. Some fleets included full Skitarii cohorts, even Onager walkers fitted with void stabilizers for zero-G engagements. One battle record, stripped from the Martian archives after being leaked, describes an incident where a Sicarian infiltrator squad silently breached an Orc ship, disabled its warp core, and vanished before alarms were even triggered. That's the level of coordination we're talking about. Psychic assets were another wild card. Unlike regular fleets, which were heavily regulated in their use of sanctioned psychers, the shard fleets often carried multiple covens of astropaths and sanctioned psychers trained in battle projection techniques. Some had choir ships, vessels converted into living psychic amplifiers, used to bombard enemy ships with nightmare visions or psychic static. These choir ships were volatile and often short-lived, but in the few instances they were deployed effectively, entire orc fleets turned on themselves in madness. Not even Gork and Mork could save them from that kind of psychic feedback. And then there were the ships that defy classification, vessels that don't appear on any registry, often appearing only once in surviving battle logs. One was described as a stretched cathedral, over 2 kilometers long, with no engines visible and a hull that shimmered like stained glass. Another seemed to operate on silent warp glides, never firing a shot, but leaving behind twisted wrecks in its wake, almost as if reality itself folded around it. I don't know if these were part of some deep Mechanicus project or something even darker, but they weren't standard. Nothing about the shard fleets ever was. That's the thing. The shard fleets weren't just tools, they were canvases, each one a unique response to a unique threat. No shared doctrine, no codex, just objective-based design and merciless creativity. And yeah, that made them terrifying, not just to the enemy but to the Imperium itself. Because if you're willing to break every rule to win a war, what do you become when the war ends? These fleets weren't about victory. They were about the question no one wanted to ask. What if you had to win at any cost? The shard fleets answered that question. And they did it with ships that shouldn't have existed, forces that shouldn't have fought, and tactics that should never have worked, but somehow did. If there's one thing that sets the shard fleets apart from the mainline forces of the Imperium, it's the complete rejection of rigidity. While traditional Imperial fleets operate like cathedral-sized battering rams, slow, ponderous, and overwhelming, The shard fleets were surgical scalpels dipped in venom. They didn't follow the usual doctrines of void warfare, no long-range broadsides and no glorious line-of-battle engagements. In fact, they avoided drawn-out fleet battles entirely, unless they had the enemy pinned and bleeding first. The philosophy behind their tactics was terrifyingly simple. Strike fast, hit hard, vanish before retaliation. Think of it like this. Where a normal fleet might spend weeks preparing for a siege, the shard fleets would instead disable a planet's orbital defenses with a coordinated psi attack, then drop sabotage teams onto the surface, ignite civil unrest or viral sabotage, and be gone before the enemy even realized they were under siege. It wasn't just unorthodox. It was brutal, efficient, and often morally bankrupt. One of the most important concepts embedded in their doctrine was something called environmental liquidation. This wasn't about conquering territory, it was about denying it. If a planet supplied the Orks with food, fuel, or material, it didn't matter if it had billions of human lives on it. The shard fleet would glass the surface, overload the tectonic faults, or worse, introduce bioalgorithms that turned organic matter into inert sludge. That level of strategic indifference to life made them terrifying not only to the enemy, but to friendly forces as well. There are stories of entire guard regiments abandoned mid-campaign because a shard commander decided the planet wasn't worth salvaging. Cold calculus. No emotion. What's even more unsettling is how they integrated deception as a cornerstone tactic. Most Imperial Navy engagements are loud and proud, blessed torpedoes, chants of the machine god, and volleys of macro-cannon fire echoing through the void. Shard fleets often engaged without even being detected. They'd mask their warp trails, scramble long-range augers, and use faint signals to mislead their enemies. More than one Ork warband was lured into a trap by a false distress signal, only to find themselves ambushed in a dead system by ships running silent, firing void lances from impossible angles. Fan theories have tried to reconstruct some of their most infamous operations. One shard supposedly created an artificial warp storm to isolate an Ork empire for nearly a standard decade, using forbidden tech to keep the storm active while they dismantled its outer colonies piece by piece. Another used astropathic mimicry, sending messages that appeared to come from Imperial sources to confuse and scatter enemy fleets. That's the thing about the shard fleets. They didn't just think outside the box. They nuked the box and replaced it with something terrifyingly creative. On the ground, when they deployed troops, which wasn't often, they didn't bother with frontal assaults. Instead, they used pinpoint insertions of specialists, often in the middle of a firefight or right behind enemy lines. Kill teams, rogue psychers, penal berserkers fitted with combat drugs and teleport beacons. They weren't sending soldiers to fight, they were sending chaos in humanoid form. One recorded operation involved a shard deploying suicide drone squads loaded with Ork language vox repeaters, broadcasting a false whack call that confused an entire Ork planetary force into attacking its own secondary base. And here's the real kicker. The shard fleets didn't believe in territory. To them, control was an illusion. The goal wasn't to claim systems, but to make them unusable to the enemy. This meant that they would often leave behind poisoned worlds, irradiated moons, or orbiting fields of scrap and corpse matter. One commander famously remarked, "A graveyard can't build war engines." That quote stuck with me, because it sums up their philosophy better than any strategic manual ever could. Compared to the honor-driven, ritual-heavy engagements of the standard Navy, this kind of warfare feels almost alien. Regular Void Admirals rely on patterns, sacred battle formations, and predictable escalation. The shard fleets rewrote every rule in the book. Their fleet formations looked like scattershot madness to any outside observer, ships attacking from different vectors, moving asynchronously, never staying still, always pushing the enemy off balance. The Orks, for all their brutality, thrive on momentum. Shard tactics shattered that momentum before it could build. That's why they worked. It's also why they scared everyone else. Other commanders hated operating near shard fleets. Communication was minimal, support non-existent, and coordination a nightmare. But more than that, there was this creeping dread, like maybe you were witnessing something you shouldn't, something the Imperium had tried to bury. I've read reports from senior officers who described their time serving alongside a shard fleet as haunting or morally compromising. One even admitted to requesting reassignment just to stop dreaming about what he'd seen a choir ship do to an Orc warlord's command barge. In some ways, their tactics mirror those of Xenos races, especially the Eldar or even the Tau. Precision, disruption, unpredictability. But with none of the finesse. The shard fleets didn't aim for elegance. They aimed for extinction, and they succeeded more often than not. But the question that keeps coming back, the one that gnaws at me every time I reread these reports, is simple. At what cost? Tactically, they were nearly flawless. Philosophically, they were a descent into something darker than war. Something predatory. Something that didn't just want to beat the enemy, but to erase the very concept of resistance. The Orcs may not be thinkers, but even they learned to fear the shards in a way they never feared a regular fleet. And if that doesn't say something about the price of innovation in the 41st millennium, I don't know what does. To really get why the shard fleets were aimed specifically at the Orcs, you have to understand just how maddening it is to fight them. Most people outside the Imperial military machine think of Orcs as dumb brutes, loud, green, stupid. But that's the most dangerous lie of all. Orcs aren't just strong or violent. They're relentless, adaptive, and horrifyingly contagious. You don't fight an Orc warband. You fight a biological and cultural phenomenon that spreads like wildfire through war, wreckage, and even failure. Unlike Tyranids, who consume and move on, or Eldar who strike and vanish, Orcs settle. They infest. A single spore can grow into a warband. A lost battle can scatter spores across a dozen worlds. Win or lose, Orcs win. That's the twisted logic that makes them such a nightmare. So standard Imperial tactics, which rely on slow-moving fleets, defensive lines, and calculated attrition, just don't work. You wipe out a war boss, and another one grows, sometimes literally, from his remains. You glass a planet, and spores in the soil rebuild the horde. There's no end, just growth. By the time the shard fleets were activated, several Orc incursions had already spiraled out of control in Segmentum Pacificus and the southern fringes of Ultima Segmentum. These weren't minor raids. They were proto-wags, starting to unify under emerging war bosses. That's when Command realized they weren't just dealing with random green savagery. They were dealing with something that could snowball into a sector-wide collapse. The usual fleets couldn't keep up. Orcs don't fight on a timetable. They slam into a system, loot it, and if resistance is stiff, they just drop spores and move on to the next one. Their fleets aren't elegant or disciplined, but they're fast, numerous, and unpredictable. And unlike the Imperium, they don't need functioning logistics. Orcs fight better when they're hungry, bored, or pissed off. You can't outlast that with prayer and plasma. So the High Lords needed something new. Something that didn't try to outmuscle the Orcs, but outthink them, outmaneuver them, break their rhythm. That's why the shard fleets were chosen. Because they weren't bound to the slow grind. Because they didn't care about holding systems or planting flags. Their goal was simple: cut off the head before the body could grow. Destroy the rising Wag energy before it could reach critical mass. Hit hard, disappear, destabilize. To fight chaos with something just as chaotic, but smarter. And it worked in a way that nothing else did. Orcs are creatures of momentum. They get stronger the more they fight. Their weird Gestalt psychic field actually makes their tech work better if they believe it should. So if you let them keep punching, they become unstoppable. But if you disrupt them, deny them battle, split up their forces, kill their mechs before the war engines get built, they start unraveling. That's where the shard fleets shined. They'd strike deep into Orc territory, target weird things like factories hidden in asteroid fields, breeding caves on half-formed moons, or mech labs floating in dead voids. Not glorious targets, just critical ones. There's this well-known account, at least among naval analysts, of Shard Fleet Ferrum 6 executing a phantom assault across 3 systems simultaneously. They didn't engage in a single ship-to-ship battle. Instead, they used warp-laced drones to scatter viral mimetic data across Ork comms, convincing a dozen warbands that they were under attack by each other. The result? A week of inter-Ork warfare that wiped out more than half the enemy's forward force without a single Imperial casualty. That's the kind of efficiency no regular fleet could replicate. And it's not just about the Orks' biology or behavior. It's about psychology. Orks love war, but they need a fight that makes sense. They follow strength. They rally around loudness, momentum, visible domination. When you take that away, when you hit them in ways they can't see or understand, they start losing focus. Some fan theories even suggest that certain shard attacks were designed specifically to confuse the Ork Gestalt field, to make their collective belief system falter. Like attacking Ork idols with sonic weapons that distorted their war chants or using psychic noise to disrupt mech energy. It's speculative, sure, but when you're dealing with a species powered partially by belief, psychological warfare becomes more than just a tactic. It becomes an existential weapon. Some commanders hated this approach. They saw it as dishonorable, too Xenos in its execution. But that's exactly why it worked. You can't bring a power sword to a bar fight with 100,000 Orks and expect to win. You bring a virus, a lie, and a fleet that doesn't play by the rules. The Orks never knew what hit them, literally. By the time they mobilized to retaliate, the Shard fleet was already gone, wreckage in its wake, spores incinerated mid-air, war bosses assassinated in their sleep by what may have been psychic constructs or maybe just void-tuned snipers. No one knows for sure. And I think that mystery, that sense of intangible death, was part of the point. Orks are loud. They like loud. They expect loud. The Shard fleets were silence, a kind of surgical horror that didn't just beat the Orks. It broke the idea that war had to be messy, glorious, or even visible. And that's probably why they were effective, and also why they were feared by everyone else. Because in a galaxy defined by endless war, the Shard fleets whispered a new language of death. One the Orks were never meant to understand. But they learned. And that's when things started to change. The moment the Shard fleets were finally unleashed against the Orks didn't come with fanfare or declarations. There were no trumpet blasts, no triumphant words from Terra broadcast across the stars. The first blows were quiet, almost surgical. You could blink and miss them, unless you were paying attention to the warp signatures, the sudden void silences, the inexplicable drops in Ork communications. That's when you'd realize something had shifted. The Imperium had stopped reacting and had started hunting. The campaign began in the Grazine Belt, a fringe region in Segmentum Pacificus that had become a breeding ground for Ork infestations. The area was a mess of asteroid fields, hollowed-out moons, and derelict mining stations, perfect terrain for Ork mech boys to hide and fester. Regular Navy patrols couldn't root them out. It was like trying to kill rats in a junkyard with a hammer. So Command handed it over to a group designated as Shard Theta 17. And just like that, the system went silent for over a month. When contact was re-established, Imperial surveyors found something that didn't fit any known combat pattern. The Ork warbands hadn't been destroyed in open battle. They were gone. Gone in the sense that their war hulks were still floating in orbit, their hulls untouched by macro fire, but their interiors were empty. As if something had slipped inside and taken them apart from within. No plasma scarring, no las burns, just clean cuts, missing weapons, and signs of systems being deliberately sabotaged. It wasn't war, it was theft on a military scale. Other shards followed with equally unconventional entries. Shard Ferrum 9 began its assault on the Ork-held world of Daka's Point, not by firing a single shot, but by targeting the orbiting space Hulk's power grid with a warp disruption relay. The Hulk's systems crashed, its artificial gravity reversed in a pulse that sent thousands of Orks smashing into bulkheads and ceilings. Then the strike teams arrived. Not in drop pods or thunderhawks, but in repurposed mining drills that burst from the planet's crust hours later. No warning, no mercy. And then there was Shard Umbra 4. No one even knows where they came from. Their arrival at the Bakron expanse is marked only by a spike in ambient warp radiation and the sudden collapse of Ork comms across 5 sectors. What little we do have comes from a salvaged Ork mechboy recorder found embedded in a burnt-out wreck. The audio is garbled, mostly shouting and explosions, but one line stands out, translated as best as possible. "Da silence is screamin'. It's ripping my teeth off." What does that even mean? No one knows. But that quote still gets passed around forums and black-inked naval logs like a myth. A fragment of something bigger. What's wild is how little fanfare these first strikes got inside the Imperium. Probably intentional. The High Lords didn't want questions. No declarations of victory, no details released to the regiments, just reallocated resources and mission redactions. But the patterns were obvious if you looked close enough. Sectors once deemed unsalvageable were suddenly cleared. Systems that had sent panicked astropathic messages begging for help would go dark, and then a few weeks later would start transmitting calmly again under new command. What's eerie is how consistently the Shard fleets avoided conventional engagements. They didn't meet the Orks head-on. Instead, they destabilized the structure of the WAG before it could fully form. Some shards targeted only supply lines, others hit mech workshops or psychic nodes, areas where weird boys were being groomed into full-blown warp conduits. The idea was clear: decapitate the Orks while they were still growing. Stop the war before it became a crusade. One of the more documented operations was carried out by Shard Medan 14. They didn't just attack an Ork moon fortress, they infiltrated it over a span of days. The logs show that their ships docked with the asteroid under the guise of salvagers, planted psionic jammers across its crust, and unleashed neurostimulant fog through its ventilation systems. When the Orks finally realized something was wrong, half of them were already in a berserker rage, tearing into each other. Medan 14's kill teams dropped in during the chaos and slaughtered the survivors with plasma rifles and blade servitors. Clean, clinical, efficient. You can imagine what this did to morale on both sides. For the Orks, it was like running into a predator that didn't roar, didn't charge, didn't even seem to enjoy the kill. Just a silent executioner that came out of nowhere and left nothing behind. For the Imperium's forces who were aware of the Shard fleet's operations, it was a revelation. A new kind of warfare. Some were terrified, others inspired. Many were both. But perhaps what's most fascinating is how coordinated it all seemed, despite the fleet supposedly operating independently. Some have theorized that a hidden command core, maybe a rogue AI or a psychic gestalt, was quietly directing the entire campaign. Others think the fleets were in communication through encrypted astropathic pulses, each pulse carrying hundreds of coordinated target points across systems. No one's ever confirmed it. The archives, where they exist at all, are scrubbed clean. Still, what can't be denied is the results. The opening months of the Shard campaign saw an unprecedented drop in Ork incursions across nearly a dozen hot zones, not due to pitched battles, not because of massive losses on either side, but because the Orks simply weren't there anymore. Their ships gutted, their planets silenced, their momentum shattered. It was as if the Shard fleets reached into the future, saw what could happen if the Orks were allowed to rise, and struck them down before it began. But this wasn't the end of the story. These first strikes were just the beginning. The Orks weren't going to stay confused forever, and the longer the Shard fleets operated, the more they pushed the limits, not just of warfare, but of what the Imperium would tolerate from its own creations. The first blows were clean, surgical, but the war that followed, that's where things started getting messy. Here's where things start to blur, between brilliance and madness, between surgical genius and unhinged brutality. The early stages of the Shard campaign felt like a revolution. Every report, every recovered data fragment, every witness account pointed to a new way of fighting the Orks that was terrifyingly effective. Shard fleets weren't just cleaning out strongholds, they were rewriting the entire approach to void warfare. But as the campaign went on, something changed. Or maybe it was always there, under the surface. A kind of unraveling that made even hardened inquisitors uncomfortable. The victories kept piling up at first. Orc-held systems simply collapsed, not in massive, glorious engagements with Imperial banners flying and hymns blaring through the void. No, these were quiet victories, cold, efficient, entire supply chains severed in a matter of days. Weird boy conclaves turned into glass sculptures overnight by what appeared to be orbitally deployed gravity distorters. Mech foundries found smoldering, their creators atomized into nothing by precision warp flares. Some said the Shard fleets had rediscovered lost Dark Age weaponry. Others whispered that they'd begun using things no longer fully human to execute their missions. But even in the middle of these wins, people started asking questions. Not because of what was being destroyed, but how. There was a case where Shard Ferrum 7 reportedly redirected a rogue moon into an Orc fleet yard orbiting the world of Krugdaka. The resulting impact annihilated the Orcs, yes, but it also triggered tectonic instability across 3 habitable moons, rendering them lifeless for the next few thousand years. Billions of Imperial civilians were on those moons. The log said they were acceptable losses. Acceptable. That word stuck in my throat like a bone. Is that what victory is now? And then came the outliers. Operations that didn't go as planned. Shard Umbra 8, for example, was tasked with eliminating a rising Orc war boss known as Warlord Gitslug, who had been assembling one of the fastest-growing clusters in the region. Their strategy was textbook Shard. Drop in, destabilize, kill the head. But Gitslug didn't play fair. He'd somehow captured Imperial prisoners from previous conflicts and fed them false intel. When Umbra 8 made their strike, the Orcs were waiting. What followed was a massacre, not of the Shard soldiers, but of logic itself. Apparently, Gitslug had mimicked Shard fleet tactics. He split his warband into hunter-killer mobs, used decoys, even deployed Orc psychers to jam astropathic signals. The Orcs learned. Fast. Umbra 8 was dismantled over the course of a week, their ships hunted one by one and decorated with Orc glyphs that mocked the Shard insignia. The data record from their flagship ended mid-transmission with the phrase, "They learned too fast." That phrase gives me chills every time. Another Shard, Delta 4, attempted to use a psychospatial disruption beacon over the fortress world of Bork's Maw. The idea was to destabilize localized warp flows and collapse the Orc presence into itself. It worked, technically, but the feedback loop triggered a cascading warp implosion that tore a hole in real space 3 light-years wide. What remained wasn't a battlefield. It was an eye, a glowing, impossible eye of raw warp energy. Delta 4 was never heard from again, and now the sector has a standing quarantine enforced by 2 black ships and an entire Ordo Malleus battle group. Still, people in the higher levels of the Imperium kept pushing the Shard campaign forward, because for every loss, there were a dozen unrecorded wins, places where Orcs were simply erased. Cut short. War bosses assassinated before they even earned a name. It became a question of utility versus control. The Shard fleets couldn't be predicted, but they could deliver results most of the time. And that was enough to keep the experiment going, at least until it wasn't, because here's where the genius started mutating into something darker. There are reports, quiet ones, buried deep, that some Shard commanders stopped reporting altogether, not out of loss, but out of choice. They went dark, claiming that traditional channels were compromised. A few even began marking their own objectives, drifting into systems not listed in their original deployment orders. There's one case of a shard allegedly purging an entire Imperial Forge world under the justification that it was harboring Orc-tainted scrap tech. No trial, no verification, just erasure. So was it chaos or genius? Maybe both. The line between them became harder and harder to see. When you give a weapon full autonomy, can you really be surprised when it starts cutting in directions you didn't expect? That's the lesson a lot of analysts try to take from this campaign, that you can't build a storm and expect to steer it forever. The shard fleets were designed to be unpredictable, but that same unpredictability made them a danger to everyone, including the Imperium itself. And yet, you can't argue with the results. By the midpoint of the campaign, Orc expansion in the targeted sectors had been reduced to isolated skirmishes. The big wahs were gone. The Orc moons no longer pulsed with mech factory signals. Entire green-skinned populations either collapsed or cannibalized each other in frenzied confusion. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was something heavier, like the galaxy was holding its breath. I remember reading one final report from a junior communications officer stationed near the Orc world of Grizak Prime. He wrote, "We thought they were ghosts. Then we realized they weren't ghosts. Ghosts don't leave patterns. They leave memories. These things, they were equations with teeth." That stuck with me, because it captures what the shard fleets became, not just soldiers or fleets or weapons, but expressions of cold mathematical brutality, engines of necessity. And when the Orcs finally started adapting, when they began mimicking the tactics that had undone them, that's when it all began to unravel. Because chaos, no matter how carefully you shape it, always has a way of breaking free. The Imperium, in all its vast, ancient rigidity, is not a creature that adapts quickly. It doesn't like change. It survives on tradition, inertia, and holy writ. So when the results of the Shard Fleet campaign started coming in, systems cleared, Orc forces scattered, WAGs dismantled before ignition, you'd think the High Lords and Segmentum Command would be celebrating. But that's not really what happened. The reaction from within the Imperium was complicated, uneasy, like someone staring at a miracle but realizing it came with blood on the altar. At first, it was denial. The early reports of success were downplayed, attributed to conventional reinforcements or spontaneous Orc infighting. You'd have entire sectors reporting Orc presence eradicated without a single proper void battle, and the official answer would be something vague like environmental collapse or spontaneous Orc degeneration, as if Orcs just gave up and walked into the void. But behind the closed doors of command briefings, it was a different story. Admirals whispered about fleets that didn't exist. Generals found their planned deployments canceled because the threat has been neutralized. No medals, no glory, just empty systems and erased data. Some factions within the Navy and Astra Militarum were deeply disturbed. These were career officers who'd spent decades memorizing fleet doctrines, who'd sworn oaths to follow the sacred patterns of naval engagement. To them, the Shard fleets were an affront, not just because they broke the rules, but because they succeeded while doing it. And that success started making a lot of people nervous. If these rogue formations could dismantle threats without oversight, without bureaucracy, what did that say about the entire command structure of the Imperium? There were petitions, real ones, filed to the Senatorum Imperialis, demanding that Shard operations be reviewed, even dismantled. A few Lord Admirals reportedly resigned in protest. One famously declared, "We are training loyal warriors. They are unleashing dogs with knives for teeth." Harsh, but honestly not inaccurate. Because by this point, it wasn't just about whether the Shard fleets were winning. It was about how they were winning, and whether that kind of victory was sustainable or even acceptable. Meanwhile, the Inquisition was strangely quiet. That's what really set off alarm bells. Normally, if you so much as glanced at an unblessed cogitator the wrong way, you'd have a rosette in your face and a bolt round in your chest. But with the shard fleets, silence. No public investigations, no trials, just quiet audits, redacted logs, and the sudden reassignment or disappearance of anyone who knew too much. It's like the Ordo Xenos had gotten exactly what they wanted and were making sure no one else asked the wrong questions. But while the Imperium stumbled over itself trying to process what it had created, the Orks were doing something far more terrifying. They were learning. At first, the Greenskins responded the way they always do. Rage, violence, more Daka. They threw their warbands at shadows, launched counterstrikes against systems that were already empty, started building bigger, louder ships to overwhelm whatever ghosts were hunting them. But it didn't work. They kept losing, and that's when things shifted. Orks aren't stupid, not really. They're instinctively adaptive. And when enough of them die in the same confusing way, their collective subconscious starts to change. Some war bosses began to break away from the usual brawling mob tactics and form splinter groups that mimicked shard behaviors. Hit-and-run raids, stealth ambushes, coordinated orbital strikes. These weren't just accidents. They were learned behaviors. One mech in particular, Big Mech Kratzpeak, became infamous for building ghost fleets designed to move without emitting Gork field resonance. Think about that for a second. An Ork building ships designed not to be loud. That's like a cornate berserker deciding to whisper. It shouldn't happen, but it did. And then there were the Psychers, the weird boys. Something about the way the shard fleet struck, so sudden, so precise, seemed to shake the Ork warp field. It got unpredictable. Some weird boys started receiving visions of the black ships with no faces, and entire mobs would refuse to go to war zones where these ghost fleets had been spotted. Superstition started creeping in. The Orks were scared, not of dying. Orks don't fear death, but of being hunted, of being made irrelevant. That's a completely different kind of terror. In one of the strangest reactions, a war boss named Grolma Gitblasta held an entire contest among his lieutenants to figure out how to outsneak the sneaky Humies. The winner was a Nob who created a warband that painted their armor mat black and tried fighting in complete silence. No shouting, no drums, no whoa-whack cries. Just tactical nods and hand signals. It didn't last long, obviously. Orks can't suppress themselves forever. But the fact that it even happened is mind-blowing. They weren't just reacting, they were evolving. And it freaked the Imperium out, because if the shard fleets were designed to strike before the Orks could adapt, what happens when they do? When Orks begin to fight like ghosts and still retain their brute resilience? You end up with an enemy that's unpredictable, cunning, and nearly impossible to demoralize. A nightmare built in your own image. That's the legacy the Shard campaign was starting to leave behind. This creeping dread that the Orks weren't just bouncing back. They were mutating into something worse. Back on Terra, the bureaucrats were divided. Some wanted to pull the plug immediately, shut the Shard fleets down before the backlash got any worse. Others argued that the only way to win was to go even deeper, to build more shards, refine the tactics, double down. The arguments got ugly, and in the chaos, the fleets kept operating, semi-autonomous, barely monitored. Some reports even suggest they began creating their own supply lines, raiding rogue trader stations, even forging alliances with less hostile Xenos forces to maintain operational independence. That's where the line between weapon and threat started to disappear. The Orks responded with teeth. The Imperium responded with fear. And somewhere in the void between those reactions, the Shard fleets continued to burn across the stars, unstoppable, unclaimed, unexplained. Victory in the Imperium is rarely clean. It's almost never kind. But with the Shard fleets, the cost of victory became something else, something harder to define. On paper, the campaign was a success, a massive one. Dozens of Ork wags stopped before they could reach critical mass. Entire subsectors that had been overrun were cleared in record time. Systems that were considered permanently lost were suddenly quiet. The Orks, for all their savagery and resilience, were outplayed, outmaneuvered, outwitted. But that silence, the void left behind, wasn't peace. It was absence. And it came at a cost the Imperium hadn't calculated. Let's start with the obvious: lives. The shard fleets weren't bound by the usual codes of engagement. Civilian losses were high, sometimes catastrophic. If a system was deemed compromised, it was wiped. Not negotiated with, not defended, not evacuated. Just cleansed. There are stories, so many stories, about Imperial colonies that were declared strategically irrelevant and reduced to ash. Not by Orks, by us, by our own. And the justification was always the same: deny the enemy their tools. Cold logic, brutal math. But that doesn't make the screams any quieter. Some say the death toll from shard actions may have exceeded the Ork casualties. That's the kind of thing you can't verify, of course. Records were purged, logs redacted, entire fleet engagements reclassified or wiped from the archives. But survivors talk, and the things they say about abandoned guard regiments, cleansing fire protocols, cities left to rot in silent orbit. It paints a picture not of precision warfare, but of strategic indifference to human life. And then there's the moral cost. You can't fight like monsters without becoming one. That's not just a poetic line. It's a truth written across the hulls of every shard vessel that went dark. Some commanders never returned. Others came back twisted, paranoid. There are recorded instances of shard captains ordering the execution of their own command crews because they believed they'd been compromised by Ork psyker fields. One captain jettisoned all of his astropaths into space because he was convinced they were channeling a green god. He wasn't punished. He was promoted. But maybe the scariest cost was institutional. The moment the shard fleet started working, the Imperium's faith in its own doctrines began to fracture. The old ways, slow wars, ritual-heavy command, ponderous movement through space, started to look obsolete. Not in theory, of course. No one on Terra was going to admit that. But in whispers, in planning rooms, in darkened war cells, commanders started wondering if maybe the old rules were holding them back. And once you let that kind of doubt in, it spreads. There were rumors that the Adeptus Mechanicus tried to reclaim some of the shard tech once the campaign wrapped up. But when they opened those ships, they found things that didn't match Martian schematics. Warped hull plating, machines that reacted to thought, reactors that pulsed like hearts. Some of it might have been Xenos in origin. Some of it might have been ancient human tech from the dark age of technology. But the fact remains. These weren't Imperial ships anymore. Not really. They were something else. Something grown. And what about the knowledge gained? Tactically, the shard fleets proved that asymmetry works. That flexibility trumps mass. That the enemy can be defeated by outthinking them rather than outgunning them. Those lessons were worth their weight in throne gelt, but they were also dangerous. Because now there are people in high places, very high places, who believe the Imperium should never go back to the old way. That the future isn't about faith or tradition. It's about efficiency, about results. That's how you get inquisitors forming private fleets, rogue traders operating as paramilitary ghost cells, sector lords commissioning black shards outside of any official register. Once you accept the logic of victory at any cost, it doesn't stop with the Orks. It starts spreading, and the line between enemy and ally gets thinner, sometimes non-existent. The Orks, for all their brutality, don't worry about this kind of thing. They fight, they die, they grow back. That's their strength and their curse. But the Imperium, we remember, we carry the weight. And the truth is, the Shard campaign didn't just hurt the Orks. It cracked the soul of the machine that built it. I've read reports that the Ecclesiarchy still refuses to acknowledge the role the Shard fleets played in certain victories. They hold services for the fallen, but never mention the weapons that won the war. They bless planets that were delivered from greenskin filth without saying how. Because how do you give thanks for a savior that also burned half your cities to the ground? Some fans call the Shard fleets the necessary evil of the Imperial war machine. Others see them as a warning of what happens when you let the need for victory override every other consideration. I think both views are true. The shards were a success, and they were a catastrophe. They were brilliant. They were monstrous. They won the war, and they broke something doing it. So what was the cost of victory? Maybe it wasn't just the lives lost or the planet scorched. Maybe the real price was that, for a moment, the Imperium glimpsed a future where it didn't need honor or glory or faith, just results. And maybe that future scared us more than the Orks ever did. And then, just like that, they were gone. No grand finale, no formal disbanding, no parades, no decommissioning ceremonies. The shard fleet simply vanished, one by one, system by system, shard by shard. Some stopped responding to calls. Others were redirected into classified sectors and never returned. A few, according to fragmented astropathic accounts, dissolved into the warp itself. Whether by accident, sabotage, or intention, nobody really knows. What we do know is that by the time the Ork threat had been suppressed and the quiet aftermath settled over the affected regions, the shards had already become ghosts. Some fans like to imagine they were dismantled by the High Lords out of fear that the moment their usefulness ended, they were seen as a threat. There's weight to that theory. The Imperium never deals well with things it can't control. And the shard fleets, by the end of their campaign, were essentially autonomous war machines with no clear command hierarchy, operating with classified weaponry and unrestricted authority. In a universe obsessed with structure and hierarchy, that's not a fleet, that's a liability. There are rumors that certain shard admirals were brought before closed tribunals. Not punished exactly, but reassigned. The kind of reassignment that ends with a ship slipping into warp and never coming back. One such admiral, the infamous Sariel Routh, was last seen leaving the bridge of his vessel with a smile on his face and a single sentence recorded in the ship's logs. "Our work was never meant to be remembered." That line gets quoted a lot in certain circles, usually by people who think the shards are still out there, just waiting. Other shards may have destroyed themselves, intentionally or not. Several were operating with experimental warp technology, unstable reactor configurations, or even partially sentient command interfaces. There are theories, wild ones admittedly, that the fleets were evolving beyond their creators' control. That some began rewriting their own directives, prioritizing their internal logic over the missions they were originally designed for. And once that started happening, the Imperium had no choice but to quietly erase them, not out of malice but out of fear of what they were becoming. The Ordo Xenos, who likely played a role in their creation, has maintained total silence. Not denial, silence. And in a galaxy as loud and paranoid as the Imperium, silence is far more ominous. Whenever someone tries to dig into Shard Fleet records, what few remain, they hit redactions, black bars, entire archives marked "requires level null." Even Inquisitors have been known to get pushback. That doesn't happen unless something big is being hidden or protected. I've spoken with Void veterans who swear they saw remnants of shard vessels decades after the official end of the campaign. A black-hulled ship drifting through the void, bearing no transponder, no heraldry, emitting no signal, yet clearly Imperial in design. In one case, a rogue trader tried to hail such a ship and was instantly bombarded with encrypted Vox code that caused several crew members to suffer temporary memory loss. The trader never tried again. Some say the shard fleets weren't destroyed. They just went dark, that they're still out there, watching, waiting, maybe even operating under some long-range protocol no one alive remembers authorizing. Think about it. A network of hidden fleets, surgically precise, emotionally detached, equipped with warp-bending tech and psyops tools that haven't been seen since. That kind of weapon isn't something you just throw away. Maybe the Imperium didn't get rid of them at all. Maybe it just buried them deep enough that only the desperate or the insane would ever try to find them again. And here's the weird part. You'd think someone would have tried to rebuild the program. The results were too effective, the tactics too revolutionary. But it never happened. Not officially. Some war zones have tried shard-style operations since then, limited, localized copycats, but they always fall short. Because the shards weren't just a method, they were a mindset, a complete rejection of Imperial tradition in favor of raw, adaptive warfare. You can't half-measure that. You're either all in or you're not, and going all in means accepting what you might become. There's one particularly eerie data fragment I came across during my research. Origin unknown, possibly astropathic bleed or salvaged from a derelict relay. It reads, "Directive sustained. Observation continues. No contact. The enemy adapts. So do we." That's it. No timestamp, no origin signature. Just those words. If it's real, and I'm not saying it is, it suggests that something survived. Something still running the playbook long after the rest of us stopped reading it. So why were the shard fleets never used again? Maybe the better question is, did they ever stop? I think about that sometimes. About how many unexplained disappearances happen in supposedly pacified sectors. About the ships that never return, the systems that go silent, the strange echoes in the warp that don't match anything on record. Maybe they're still out there. Maybe they never stopped doing what they were built to do. And if they ever come back, I don't know if it'll be as saviors or as something else entirely. So what do we make of it all? The shard fleets came from the shadows, fought without recognition, and disappeared without ceremony. They were a spark of brilliance in a machine designed to grind slowly forward through tradition and ritual. But in their brilliance, they revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the Imperium, about how far it's willing to go when cornered, about what happens when victory stops being about sacrifice and starts being about cold, calculated elimination. They fought the Orks in ways no one thought possible. They struck before the wags could build momentum, dismantled the very energy of green war before it could erupt. They burned across the stars like phantom blades, rewriting the rules of naval warfare, of asymmetry, of fear itself. And for a time, they won. They won in a way that no crusade or retribution fleet ever truly did. But that kind of victory comes at a cost, not just in lives, but in soul, in what the Imperium had to become, had to allow, to make them work. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was a question, one no one wanted to answer. Were the shard fleets a glimpse into the future of Imperial warfare? Or were they a mistake, a necessary evil we buried before it could redefine who we are? Were they a cure for a specific disease, or a symptom of a deeper rot? And most haunting of all, did they really vanish? Or are they simply waiting? Waiting for the next moment of desperation, the next uncontainable threat, the next wah too large for doctrine to stop. When the prayers no longer work and the banners fall silent, maybe then, the shards will return, not to save us, not to serve us, but to do what they were built for. And if they do, what will we call them? Heroes, traitors, monsters, or just necessary? If you've made it this far into the story, thank you. These kinds of topics, the strange edges of Imperium history, the whispers and ghost files, deserve to be explored, discussed, questioned. This isn't just lore. It's the uncomfortable gray area where faith, war, and desperation collide. Let me know what you think. Were the shard fleets a tactical masterpiece or a mistake that should never be repeated? Do you believe they're still out there? Have you come across theories or old records I missed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read all of them. And if you want more deep dives into the darker corners of Warhammer lore, from lost campaigns to forbidden tech and theories the ecclesiarchy would rather see burned, you know what to do. Subscribe, share, and join the growing archive of those of us who ask the questions no one else dares to. The Imperium is vast. Its truths are stranger than its lies. And sometimes the stories that get erased are the ones we need the most.